Hi everybody, it's James Mahoney from Black Lobster Academy. Welcome to part 8 of my introduction to Adobe Photoshop for illustrators and artists. In the last episode we covered vector graphics, focusing mainly on creating and editing paths and using the pen tool as well as the shape tool, vector masks, and paths panel. In this episode we're going to cover using filters and how to make common image color adjustments. Let's do it. Making image adjustments. When making image adjustments or applying filters, it's a good habit to copy the layer you want to adjust before making any adjustments. This allows you to easily back out or ease off the adjustments. If you have an active selection, then naturally the adjustment will only apply to the selected area of the active layer. If nothing is selected, then the entire layer will be adjusted. Command-J will quickly duplicate a layer. All of the image adjustments can be found in the Image menu under Adjustments. I'll walk you through some of the most useful ones. Select your adjustment here, and an interface specific to the adjustment will appear. Most adjustments have presets you can access for common changes, and a set of controls you can use to make custom adjustments. There's no substitute for just trying out a whole bunch of things and seeing what happens. It's the only way to learn them, really. For this part of the demo, I'll just change the color to something horrible. Hit enter to make the adjustment. Now before you do anything else, you have the opportunity to fade the adjustment you just made. Hit Command-Shift-F to bring up the fade dialog. Once you do anything else, you lose this opportunity to bring up the fader. With this dialog, you can scale back the adjustment you just made. I typically will slightly over-adjust an image and then use this slider to back off the effect. Also, in some cases, it's really handy to apply the effect using a blend mode. Hit enter to accept the fade. Now, since the adjustment was made on this layer, you can also back off the effect using the opacity slider of the layer. So that's all good, but you can do many of these same adjustments using an adjustment layer. I touched on this a bit in episode 5 on layers. Adjustment layers are way more flexible and are what is referred to as non-destructive, and that you can make the changes without making any permanent changes to the underlying source pixels. So let me show you why this works even better. You can find the adjustment layers down here from this half moon button. You'll notice that this list is nearly identical with the one from the Image menu. Select your adjustment here and a new adjustment layer is created in the Layers panel. And nearly the same adjustment interface pops up to allow you to make your changes. So you make your changes, and then hit this icon to collapse the UI. Now, as you should expect, this layer will affect all the layers below it in the stack. You can turn it on and off just like any other layer, and you can back off this adjustment using the opacity slider. And at any time you can double-click the moon icon on the layer to bring up the controls and continue to make tweaks to get it just right. It also comes by default with a layer mask. I've covered this quite a bit in other videos, and this works just like any other layer mask. You can use any imaging or paint tool to create a black and white image to designate exactly where to make the adjustment. Paint black to remove the effect. Again, this is covered more in episode 5 on layers. As if all that's not enough to make adjustment layers rock. Because it's a layer, if you option click between it and the layer below, you can use the layer below as a clipping layer to mask the adjustment to it based on its alpha channel. Speaking of masks, some of these adjustments can be applied directly to a mask. Simply click on a layer mask. And for this you'll need the menu Adjustments under Image. Since there's no color in a mask, only non-color based adjustments are enabled. Most useful are the curves and the invert adjustment, and also some filters that we'll cover later. A lot of times you'll want to invert a mask, swapping what's visible and transparent. You do this easily by hitting Command-I. Tonal adjustments using the Curve tool. I use the HSL adjustment and Curves tool adjustment tools all the time. For me, these are far and away the most useful ones. Let's go a little deep on the Curves tool. You can access the Curves tool with Command-M. Its dialog is, not surprisingly, focused on this curve right here. Let me explain how it works. As I've covered in earlier videos, each pixel is made up of red, green, and blue values, or intensities. You can think of these intensities as being in a range of values from black to white, where dark is low intensity and light is high intensity. Each pixel has its overall intensity as well, sort of like how bright the pixel is. You can see how many pixels of each value there are in this gray underlying graph here. This is called a histogram. It's made simply by counting the number of pixels at each intensity level and then showing that as a graph. So this image has no high intensity values. That means it's kind of dark. It has a lot of darks and a lot of middle tones, which you can see by these spikes. Okay, so how does this curve thing work? Try thinking of it like this. Each pixel in the image is represented down here somewhere between black and white. This curve will map those values to an output value as seen here on the left edge. With this straight line, the output is equal to the input. Blacks are black, white is white, and middle is middle. So there's no change. But with a curve like this, these pixels here have values that are above 75% intensity, and the curve now maps them down near 50%. And these values here are 50% intensity, and they are mapped by this curve to be around 25%. Let's reset the curve to the default. Let's switch to a black and white layer. I think we'll see the effect of the curves maybe a little more clearly. If you grab this handle here and move the white point lower, all the pixels with intensities above this point will be set to maximum intensity. And actually, all the values are now mapped to brighter values. You can do the opposite with the black handle. If these two are adjacent, then it's essentially the same as the threshold tool. But it's in some ways better because you can make a softer transition if you want to. If you hit the Option key while moving these handles, you can temporarily see a representation of the pixels that are getting clipped. That means data loss, and usually you want to keep that to a minimum. You can click on the curve anywhere to add an adjustment point. Then you can move the point to adjust the curve to create a nonlinear mapping from input to output. Try moving the middle values up and down. This setup is essentially the same as the Levels UI. You can add as many points as you want. You can remove selected points by hitting Delete. As usual, there's a drop-down list of preset curves for common adjustments. For example, this will increase contrast by making the darks darker and the lights lighter. You can adjust each channel independently if you want with this drop-down. For instance, I can make the dark values have more blue by selecting the blue channel and raising the blue channel values for the darks. You can add points here to keep the lighter values from changing. These droppers are very useful. You can use them to set the black point, the white point, and even the middle point. For example, here's a charcoal sketch I did of Zoe Saldana. To set the paper to be white, you just select the dropper and pick a point on the image that you want to be white. And then you can maybe back that off a little bit with a fade. Even cooler though, with this hand icon button, you can tweak the image with ultimate control. Click on a region in the image that you want to change and then slide up or down to adjust its intensity. If you're comfortable with the Curves tool, it's the only tool you'll need to adjust intensity values. And of course you can access basically the same UI when using this as an adjustment layer. Other adjustments. I'm running out of time, so I'll have to blast through the rest of these to hit the 15-minute YouTube limit. Besides the curve, the most useful adjustment tool, in my opinion, is the Hue, Saturation, and Lightness one. You access this with Command U. Although, if all you want to do is adjust the saturation, then this adjustment tool, which includes vibrance, is a better choice. But in some cases, you'll want to adjust the hue as well. If your original image is black and white, you can hit this Colorize button to add color, and then you can change the saturation and hue as you want. As I've mentioned, you invert an image with Command I. Color balance is useful for quick color corrections. Or a common adjustment is to use this to make the shadows cooler and the highlights warmer, like this. Hit Enter, and then fade it off with Command F. The black and white adjustment tool allows you to make various colors lighter or darker to create a great looking black and white image. So a common approach is to make the warm colors a bit brighter and the cool colors a bit darker. You can also give the black and white a color tint by checking this box. You can change the color here or click on it. Gradient map is pretty useful too. With this adjustment, you select a gradient, which you can adjust of course, and the image will be mapped using the gradient you select or the one you created. So the dark colors will get the colors on the left, and the light colors will get the colors on the right side of the gradient. I go over creating and editing gradients in more detail in episode 3, where I cover the gradient tool. You can reverse the mapping as well with this switch. Using image filters. You can access the image filters from the Filters menu. I'm only going to cover the most useful ones, but they're all kind of interesting. So like adjustments, it's a good idea just to play around with them and see what you can discover. Let's start with blur. There's some cool new blur features in CS6, and I have a video on my channel that shows how to use the new tilt shift blur. You might want to check that out. The most commonly used blur is the Gaussian blur, named after the famous German mathematician from the 19th century. The bigger the radius, the more the blur. Let me show you quickly how to use the new blur widgets introduced in CS6. The field blur is very useful. With this tool, you pin your blur widget on your canvas and set the blur amount with this radial dial. With just one pin, it's essentially the same as the Gaussian blur. But if you add more pins with various settings, Photoshop will blend between the blur regions. Iris blur has an extra part to the blur, which has handles to let you control where the edge of the blur is and how soft or hard the transition is. And you can move between an oval and a rectangle. When you get a chance, you should check these other blurs out too. Motion blur, for example, is very useful. Under the noise heading, there are some good ones. Median and reduce noise are both useful for removing the noise that is common to digital images. Add noise is useful as part of many different texture creation processes. Usually, you set it to monochrome and Gaussian. Despeckle is useful for smoothing out an image that was scanned from an offset printer, like a magazine or a newspaper. The offset filter found under Other is used to create seamless texture tiles. I have a separate video tutorial that covers this in detail if you're interested. Render has some useful things to offer when creating a texture. Clouds, for instance, creates a nice noisy texture and can be a good starting point for lots of different textures. Similarly, Fibers is very useful for some hair, fur, fabrics, brushed aluminum, and wood textures. We use this a lot in my digital illustration course. You can quickly add a lens flare with this one. You pick your lens type and then move this point around to get it where you want it. And just in case your image isn't cheesy enough, you can check out the style gallery. Actually, some of these are very useful sometimes, but most of them are just plain tacky. But check them out. Pick the style on the left, and then adjust any settings on the right. Best to zoom in to 100%, as these effects are resolution dependent. Sharpening images. Here's what I've found to be the best way to sharpen an image. Use the unsharp mask. This uses an edge detection algorithm and provides good controls to help you to minimize artifacts. The amount is the degree of sharpening. The radius is how far away from a detected edge to sharpen. And the threshold determines how much contrast there needs to be before Photoshop considers something an edge. So a higher threshold means only very contrasty edges will get the effect. Learn to recognize what an over-sharpened image looks like. Find that point and then back the values down. It depends a lot on the image, but typical values for radius is just a few pixels, and the threshold is usually just around 12 levels or somewhere near there. Move it higher if the image looks grainy, especially in things that should be smooth like skin. Then bring up the fade dialog and set the blend mode to luminance. And that wraps up this video. We covered general image adjustments and layer adjustments. We went into the curves tool pretty thoroughly and touched briefly on some other adjustments and filters. In the next video, we cover all the wonderful things you can do to text. Thanks for watching, and thanks for any likes, subscribes, comments, or shares.